Hello everyone, wishing you a wonderful day. Today we're going to dive into a gripping story of love loyalty and survival as we uncover whether Jack and Tu Tien can overcome the company's financial collapse after serious bridge construction violations left them unable to even pay the bank interest. Will love be enough to carry them through their darkest chapter? If you enjoy this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next videos. For a long time, the bridge collapse had hung over Jack's life like a storm cloud that refused to move. It had taken his freedom for a while, shattered his company, dragged his name through public judgment, and pushed the people he loved into fear and exhaustion. Even after he had been released and allowed to return home, the case had still remained like an open wound. There were still procedures, further questioning, legal reviews, and the constant shadow of uncertainty. It was never just about whether he had physically walked free. It was about whether the truth would ever fully return his life to him. And then, after everything, the day finally came. The authorities completed the final stage of the investigation and officially confirmed what Jack had been carrying in his heart from the very beginning. He was innocent of directly causing the bridge collapse. The evidence had become undeniable. The altered records, material substitutions, hidden approval changes, and the decisions that led to the structural failure, all traced back clearly to Fuck's wrongdoing. Jack had made mistakes in trust and oversight, yes, and he had paid dearly for them. But he had not been the one who cut corners, falsified the chain of materials, or knowingly endangered the project. The collapse that had destroyed his reputation had not been built by his intent. When the final confirmation reached him, Jack did not react the way people might have expected. He did not shout, he did not cry out in triumph. He simply sat there in silence, the paper still in his hand, staring at it as if his heart needed time to believe what his eyes were already reading. Innocent, cleared, clean, words that should have come much earlier. Words that had cost him too much by the time they finally arrived. Tu Tien was the first person he looked for. When he found her, she was sitting by the window, one hand resting over the large curve of her stomach. By then, her pregnancy had entered the final stage. She moved more slowly now, breathed a little heavier, and tired more easily. But there was also a calmness in her that had not been there before. They had survived too much together for the small, quiet moments to mean nothing anymore. Jack stopped in front of her and did not speak right away. Tu Tien looked up at him, and something in his face made her heart beat faster. "What is it?" she asked softly. Jack took another step closer and finally handed her the document. She read it once, then again, and by the second time, her eyes were already filling with tears. "Jack," she whispered. He knelt in front of her slowly, both hands resting gently over hers and over the child they had both fought so hard to protect. "It's over," he said, his voice low, rough, and full all at once. "They've officially cleared me. I'm innocent." The tears slid down Tu Tien's face immediately. Not loud tears, not broken tears. The kind that come when suffering has lasted so long that relief hurts almost as much as pain. For a moment, she could not even answer. She just looked at him, her lips trembling, her fingers tightening around the paper in her lap, as if letting go might somehow make the truth disappear. "You're really free now?" she asked. Jack nodded slowly. Yes, that single word changed the whole room. Tu Tien let out a shaky breath, then reached for him with both hands, and Jack leaned into her immediately. He rested his forehead against her knee for a second, eyes closed, and she lowered one high and dig into his hair, trembling with emotion. They had waited so long for justice that it had almost started to feel like a story that only happened to other people. But now it had finally come. Not quickly, not kindly, not without damage, but it had come. That evening, their home felt warmer than it had in years. There was no crowd, no celebration, no need for grand words. What they had regained was too intimate, too deeply earned, to be shared loudly with the world. It was enough to sit beside each other, to speak without the shadow of accusation still hanging over every breath, and to let the truth settle into the walls of the house. Jack sat close to Tu Tien the entire evening, more quietly than usual, as if some part of him was still catching up to the fact that the fight was finally over. Tu Tien noticed it and smiled softly. "You still look like you don't believe it." Jack looked at her and gave the faintest laugh. "Maybe I don't. Not yet." "Well," she said gently, guiding his hand to her stomach, "you should start believing in something happy for once." The baby moved just slightly beneath his palm. Jack froze, then his whole expression softened. That tiny movement, so small and ordinary, somehow felt bigger than the final legal decision. Because this, more than anything else, was the life waiting ahead of him now. Not the courtroom, not the investigation, not the collapse that had once defined everything. This, his hand over the child he loved before even meeting him. Tu Tien, watching him with tired, affectionate eyes. A future that, for the first time in years, did not begin with fear. In the days that followed, Jack changed in ways even he did not fully realize at first. The heaviness that had sat permanently in his shoulders seemed to ease little by little. He spoke more gently, slept more gently, slept more deeply, laughed more often, even if only in short, quiet bursts. The house no longer felt like a place where both of them were hiding from disaster. It began to feel like a place preparing for life. And more than anything, Jack became completely devoted to Tu Tien. If he had been careful with her before, now he was nearly impossible. He refused to let her lift anything. He insisted on handling every task that required effort. He made sure her meals were on time, her medicine was organized, and her rest was protected. If she stood for too long, he noticed. If she looked tired, he told her to sit. If she tried to argue, he reminded her that she was carrying the most important person in their lives. Tu Tien would laugh and tell him he was becoming impossible. Jack would answer the same way every time. "I nearly lost too much. I'm not being careless again." As the due date came closer, their conversations changed too. At night, they would lie awake talking quietly about the baby, about what kind of father Jack wanted to be, about whether the baby would have his eyes or Tu Tien's smile, about what kind of childhood they wanted to build after so much pain. Sometimes Jack would fall silent in the middle of those conversations, and Tu Tien knew why. He was thinking about everything they had survived to reach this point. He had gone from standing at a construction site believing he was building the future, to losing almost everything in a scandal he did not create, to prison cells, interrogations, shame, and fear. And now here he was, sitting beside the woman he loved, waiting for the birth of their child, with his name finally clean again. Some nights the contrast between those two lives seemed almost too great to hold in one heart. One evening, as rain tapped softly against the roof, Tu Tien was folding a few baby clothes when Jack came and sat beside her. She glanced at him and smiled. "You've been quiet all day." Jack looked down at the tiny shirt in her hands and then at the roundness of her belly. "I was just thinking," he said. "That's usually dangerous." He smiled faintly. "I was thinking a bow, and how close I came to losing all of this before it even began." Tu Tien set the little shirt down and looked at her more carefully. Jack took her hand in both of his. If the truth had come too late, if something had happened to you, if something had happened to the baby, Tu Tien squeezed his hand gently before he could keep going down that road. "But none of that happened," she said softly. "You're here. I'm here. He's here." Jack looked at her stomach and nodded. Then, after a pause, he leaned closer and pressed a kiss to her forehead. "I'm going to spend the rest of my life being grateful for that." The final days before the birth seemed to move both slowly and quickly at the same time. Every small sign made Jack alert. If Tu Tien shifted in discomfort, he noticed. If she paused during a walk, he was already beside her. Even in sleep, he seemed half awake, listening for the smallest change in her breathing. Then, one quiet night, it finally began. Tu Tien woke with a sharp pain that was different from anything she had felt before. At first, she tried to stay calm, pressing a hand to her stomach and breathing through it. But when the pain came again, Stronger, more certain this time, she reached for Jack immediately. He woke at once. Tu Tien, what is it? Her voice was tight, breath uneven. Jack, I think it's time. For 1 second, he just stared at her. Then the weight of those words hit him all at once. The child they had talked to, the child they had protected through fear, investigation, exhaustion, and danger, the child they had waited for with equal parts hope and terror. He was coming. Jack moved fast, but his hands trembled. He held Tu Tien sit up, steadied her when another pain came, gathered everything they had prepared, and got her into the car with more care than if he were carrying glass. During the drive, Tu Tien held tightly to his arm between contractions, and Jack kept telling her they were almost there, even though his own heart was pounding so hard he could barely hear his own voice. By the time they reached the hospital, the world had narrowed into one single moment. No more past, no more bridge collapse, no more investigation. Only this, Tu Tien being rushed inside, Jack following as far as he was allowed, and one trembling question rising in both of them at once. After everything they had survived, would this long road finally end in pure happiness? Or was fate preparing one more twist before it let them truly rest? Part 2. Jack stood outside the delivery room with his hands locked so tightly together that his fingers had gone cold. The hospital corridor was bright, clean, and filled with the kind of quiet urgency that made every second feel heavier. Nurses moved past him. Doctors spoke in calm voices. Wheels rolled over the polished floor. But Jack heard almost none of it clearly. His entire world had narrowed to one closed door and the woman on the other side of it, Tu Tien, and their baby. After everything they had already survived, this moment should have felt like pure joy. In many ways, it did. But joy was never simple for people who had lived through as much fear as they had. Jack knew too well how quickly life could turn. He knew how a single phone call could destroy a future, how one hidden betrayal could drag years of effort into ruin, how even happiness could arrive trembling after pain. So as he stood there waiting, hope and fear lived side by side inside him. Again and again his mind replayed the road that had brought them here. The bridge collapse, the investigation, the days he had spent under police questioning, the time he had been held while Tu Tien, pregnant and exhausted, carried everything alone. The hospital room where he learned she had nearly pushed herself too far. The day the authorities finally confirmed that he was completely innocent in the collapse that had destroyed his life for so long. And now this, the beginning of something new, the beginning of the life they had fought so hard to protect. He exhaled slowly and looked toward the delivery room doors again. From somewhere beyond them, he thought he heard movement, then silence again. Every tiny sound made his heart jump. He tried sitting down, but the chair only made him feel more trapped, so he stood again almost immediately. He paced a few steps, stopped, turned back, then paced again. It was the same restless helplessness he had once felt in other hospital corridors, but this time he refused to let his thoughts sink into panic. He had promised Tu Tien. No more fear stronger than hope. No more expecting disaster before joy had a chance to arrive. Still, when another contraction had hit her earlier and she had gripped his arm so tightly that her nails pressed through his sleeve, something inside him had shaken hard. He had seen pain in her face before. He had seen exhaustion, fear, and tears. But seeing her body fight through labor, seeing how much strength it took from her, had made him understand all over again how much women carry in silence long before anyone speaks of motherhood like something beautiful. To him, in that moment, Tu Tien had looked both strong and heartbreakingly vulnerable, and that made waiting even harder. A while later, a nurse came out briefly to ask him to sign a form and confirm a few details. Jack responded quickly, though his voice sounded strange to his own ears, as if it belonged to someone holding himself together only by force. "Is she okay?" he asked immediately after. The nurse gave a small, reassuring smile. "She's doing her best. Stay calm. Stay calm." It was the simplest instruction in the world, and at that moment it felt almost impossible. Still, Jack nodded. Then he was alone again. Minutes stretched. Time lost shape. The bright clock on the wall moved, but not in any way that made sense to his heart. He ran one hand to his hair, sat down for 2 seconds, stood up again, then leaned both palms against the wall and lowered his head. For the first time in a long time, he whispered a prayer, not for money, not for justice, not for his name, only for them. Let her be safe. Let the baby be safe. Let this one thing come to them without being taken away. At some point, his thoughts drifted to the first time he had placed his hand over Tu Tien's stomach after coming home. He remembered the small movement under his palm and how, in that instant, the future had felt real in a way it never had before. Not imagined, not hoped for, real. A son or daughter waiting to enter the world, a life that belonged to them both, a chance to build something gentle after everything harsh that had happened. He remembered talking to the baby at night, half embarrassed and half unable to stop himself. He remembered Tu Tien laughing softly and telling him he sounded like he was already trying to teach the child responsibility before birth. He remembered arguing over names, pretending not to care, only to care far too much. He remembered folding tiny clothes with her and feeling his chest tighten at the sight of something so small, belonging to a life not yet born. And now that life was only a few steps away, the delivery room doors opened at last. Jack turned so fast that the chair beside him nearly tipped over. A doctor stepped out, mask lowered, eyes calm but warm. For one terrible second, Jack could not make himself speak. The old fear flashed through him again, the kind built from too many bad updates, too many hospital corridors, too many moments where life had stood on the edge of breaking. Then he forced the question out. "Doctor," the doctor smiled. "Congratulations," he said. "You have a healthy baby boy." Jack went completely still. A healthy baby boy. The words hit him with such force that for a moment he forgot how to breathe. He stared at the doctor as if he needed to hear it again to make sure it was real. "And Tu Tien?" he asked, his voice unsteady. "She's exhausted, but she's safe. Both mother and baby are doing well." That was all it took. Relief crashed to him so suddenly that he had to grip the back of the chair beside him just to stay steady. He lowered his head for 1 second, eyes closing, and let out a breath that felt like it had been trapped in his body for years. When he looked up again, his eyes were wet. Not with the tears of grief or helplessness he had known too often, but with something lighter, something fuller, joy, real, trembling joy. The doctor said a few more things, routine information, recovery, when he could go in, but Jack barely heard them clearly. By the time he was finally allowed inside, his heart was pounding so hard it felt almost unreal. The room was softer than he expected. The light was gentler. The air itself seemed quieter. Tu Tien lay against the bed, pale and tired, her hair damp against her forehead. But when she turned her head and saw him, a weak smile touched her lips immediately. Jack moved toward her slowly at first, as if even now he was afraid that moving too quickly might wake him from a dream. Then he saw the baby, so small, so impossibly small. Wrapped carefully and lying close to Tien, warm and real, and here. Jack stopped right beside the bed and simply stared. Their son, a tiny baby boy with a soft round face, closed eyes, and the kind of fragile beauty that made Jack's chest ache all at once. He had imagined this moment 100 different ways, but none of those imagined versions prepared him for what it actually felt like to stand there and look at a life that was part of both of them. Tu Tien watched his face and smiled more fully, even through her exhaustion. "You're quiet," she whispered. Jack laughed once under his breath, though it came out almost like a broken sound. "I don't know what to say." "Then don't say anything yet." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and the gratitude in his expression was almost painful. "You did it," he said softly. Tu Tien's eyes filled with tears at once. "We did." Jack leaned down and kissed her forehead with a tenderness so careful it seemed to carry every unsaid thing inside it. "Thank you. I'm sorry. I love you. We made it. You're safe." He did not need to say any of it aloud. She felt all of it in the way he touched her. Then, with the hesitation of someone handling something sacred, Jack asked, "Can I, Faya?" Tu Tien nodded toward the baby. Jack reached down, and when the nurse guided him in how to hold his son properly, he moved as if the child were made of light. The moment the baby settled into his arms, everything in Jack's face changed. The strain he had carried for so long softened. The sorrow that had marked him through the investigation loosened. He looked at the little boy and seemed for one quiet second like a man who had stepped fully into peace for the first time in years. "He's beautiful," Jack whispered. Tu Tien watched him, tears slipping quietly down her cheeks. He looked from the baby to her and back again, and she knew he was feeling the same thing she was, that after every storm, every accusation, every hospital visit, every night of fear, this little boy was not just a child. He was hope with a heartbeat, a fresh start, a living answer to the question of whether love could survive hardship. For a while, neither of them spoke much. They didn't need to. The baby made small sounds, shifted slightly in Jack's arms, and once opened his eyes just barely before falling still again. Tu Tien watched every movement as if she could not believe he was real. Jack kept glancing at the baby's face, as if afraid that looking away too long might somehow lessen the miracle of the moment. Eventually, Tu Tien spoke first. "So," she said weakly, but with a teasing softness, "does he look more like me or you?" Jack looked down at the baby very seriously, as though the question required care. "Fool study." "Obviously me," he said. That made her laugh, even though she was too tired to do it properly. "No chance," she replied. "He's far too cute to be you." Jack smiled, and this time the smile stayed. It was not just relief now, it was happiness. The kind of happiness that arrives not because life has always been kind, but because people have survived enough pain to know exactly what a blessing feels like when it finally appears. Later, after the first rush of emotion softened into quiet, Jack sat beside Tu Tien with their baby resting between them. He kept one hand close to the child and the other over Tu Tien's fingers, linking all three of them together in one small circle of warmth. Neither wanted to leave that moment. Neither wanted to think too far ahead. And yet, somewhere beneath the joy, a quieter thought still remained. Life had taught them both that peace was precious, partly because it could never be taken for granted. Tu Tien seemed to feel the same thing, because after a long silence, she turned her head slightly toward Jack and asked the question almost in a whisper. "Do you think there will be more trouble for us?" Jack looked at her, then at their son. A long time ago, he might have answered from fear. After everything they had lived through, he answered differently. "Maybe life will still test us," he said quietly, "but not the same way. Not while we remember what really matters." Tu Tien's eyes softened. Jack leaned closer and kissed her forehead once more. Outside the room, life would still go on. There would still be wounds to heal, work to rebuild, and a future to shape. No one could promise that hardship would never come again. But in that hospital room, with their son breathing softly between them, one truth felt stronger than fear. Whatever storm might come later, they would not face it as the broken people they once were. They would face it as a family. And sometimes, that is the only kind of miracle people truly need.